Russia has one foot in Europe and another in Asia, and for centuries has tried to decide what sort of country this was, kind of went back and forth. But all things being equal, by the beginning of the 19th century, so roughly 200 years ago, when it came to music, most musicians in Russia were still either foreigners or educated abroad, because Russia didn't have its own schools. And that kind of was the path that other industries from, the actual industries that shipbuilding, whatever, or weaponry, to architecture and urban planning, it was always the same thing. First, it was the foreigners, and then the foreigners taught the Russians, and then the Russians took it from there. But there were a couple of major events, I think, that helped Russians really start traveling across Europe a lot more. And one such event, which I put at the beginning of the lecture, is the victorious Russian army in pursuit of Napoleon entering into Paris. And the Russian nobility speaks perfect French. That was the thing to do. And the French are absolutely struck by these absolutely foreign people who speak with perfect Parisian accent. They said that about the Tsar, that he spoke better than the Parisian. Of course, they were educated by proper French tutors. But it's that new acceptance that you can be in Europe, not being part of an official government mission, but just as a tourist or as a student, is probably dating from around that time. It's also a time of relative openness and stability in Russia following the Napoleonic War. So certain people go in pursuit of those industries which are still lacking inside the country, such as music. I'm not reciting the slides. This is for note-taking. Can you see? You don't want me to say what's on the slide, I hope, right? Okay, wonderful. So this is a mixture of a very peculiar kind, because this pseudo-Russian church, a later church, lives peacefully alongside a neoclassical building, which is a tradition brought by French and Italian architects. And that is kind of this cosmopolitan capital that we're talking about, where we're going to see our first conservatory. So, John Field and Cimarosa, right, so Irish and Italian, composed in Russia late 18th, early 19th century, and that's considered just fine. The absence of homegrown composers doesn't strike anyone as being strange. And therefore, young Glinka has to go to Italy to study, and what he discovers, of course, is the Italian bel canto, and comes back and writes Ruslan and Ludmila, which is basically Italian buffa. But then he says, no, this is not what we need here back home. The Russian language, its inflections, its traditions, the Russian folk song, let's do differently. And so he writes Ivan Susan and The Life of the Tsar, which is kind of the Russian opera. Brothers Rubinstein studied in Germany, they're German trained, and that actually means a lot more than just how to play the piano. Anton Rubinstein at the time is considered a rival to Liszt. So you can imagine this is a star of the first magnitude, and an extremely well-educated man. The so-called historical concerts, which it's a series on piano repertoire. According to a chronicle, 1,300 pieces were played by him in a series of recitals in European capitals and eventually in St. Petersburg as well. So that sort of education is very similar to the education, let's say, received by Brahms. So it's deeply rooted in solfege and contrapoint and fugal writing, and kind of a very thorough, very multifaceted music education, a lot more than just playing the piano. And that is what the brothers Rubinstein, Anton and Nicholas, are eventually going to bring to Russia when the time comes. The conservatories opened in the two capitals, St. Petersburg and Moscow, in late 50s, early 60s, 18 that is. And most of the teachers are from abroad. right? We already understand that. There's Belgian, there's of course Polish, Leszetitsky, who works in Vienna. Leszetitsky is a very important figure, not just for the Russian school, but also for European piano making. He has a tendency of marrying his students, and one of them he becomes a hugely important figure in Russia, teaching many of stars of first magnitude. And within about 30, 40 years, we have really a fantastic crop of Russian musicians whose names you probably know because they include Rachmaninoff and Horowitz and Prokofiev and Scriabin and many others. Whenever you look who they studied with and who their teachers studied with, the roots inevitably lead you outside of Russia, right? So how much of a Russian school is open question. It really depends on what segment of its history you look at. The traditions at that time are uninterrupted across the Russian border. Musicians kind of adhere to the same ideals of touch and tone and repertoire and personal bearing as they would in Paris or Berlin or New York. And communications are very open. It's really an open border at that point. It's truly, there's nothing easier in, let's say, 1880 than take a 3-day, 2-day train to Paris to see an exhibition or even to hear a concert, and that's frequently done. That, by the way, that's how much of French modern art, I think Matisse or Picasso gets into Russia in the first place. It's just people with money and influence who are interested in acquiring these collections take the train. It's very easy. And so, what it is that these people wanted? Throughout the history of our instrument, the instrument itself and the people who played it, they kind of developed hand in hand. They developed together. Composers and pianists approach the makers and they say, we would like to have this. And the makers come up with some new invention or solution and they approach the performance and say, what do you think of that? And a certain sound and a certain touch are being shaped, I think, towards the beginning of the recording era. You can hear it. The playing is very light, very brilliant. There's not that much pedal. Sometimes there's extraordinary amount of rubato that would make us squint, but was considered normal. And a very limited repertoire, really. We will talk about this in a second. So it's kind of my own list, but that list, of course, is not complete. It probably involves a couple of things that make me unique. That is very important, especially since most recitals would invariably have at least half devoted to Chopin. It doesn't seem to us that we have to play Chopin when we play a piano recital, but believe me, because I looked into it by looking at very old piano programs. There's a book that lists those, that most recitals of that period, let's say 1900, even 1915 and 1920, would always look similar. There would be a piece by Haydn, Mozart, which would be followed by Beethoven's sonata, and a bunch of showpieces to close off the first half, and then the second half would be Chopin. A mixture of larger and smaller works, with some lists, and some really experimentally minded people would play Debussy piece. Yes, so that's kind of how it went. And that required pianists to differ from one another. And that would often manifest itself in how they phrased and how they pedaled, what tempi they took, and what fingering they used. Fingering was secretive. You wouldn't share it with another pianist. It's only later, when that period drew to a close, that publishers like Schirmer and others would approach famous pianists and say, could you edit Chopin for us? Could you edit Schumann? And then you would see the fingering, maybe for the first time. But until then, it was a big secret. It was considered normal for our pianists to be also composers and arrangers, and that probably is the last time we see that these are still the same person. How many people here compose and arrange? I know I don't. Fantastic. Few hands. But imagine that this is part of your training, that you all study composition, you all study arranging, you all study orchestration very seriously. You all take score reading and read orchestral scores. It would change the way you look at the music. It would change the way you look at your piano pieces, right? So it shouldn't surprise us that even people that we don't necessarily consider to be like composers, they still wrote a lot of music, or at least arranged music, right? In some cases are more known than others, but Leschetizky was a composer. We will hear him play his own piece. And some people did not shy away from editing music of their beloved Chopin by adding octaves and passing voices, or like Godowsky arranging an etude for left hand alone. Well, we talked about this, but now we will talk about virtuosity, right? So if you are not a high-class virtuoso, you're sort of not fit. And the true test was, of course, Chopin Liszt etudes, transcendental etudes, larger compositions, concertos. It is remarkable to what extent master teachers like Liszt did not want to deal with people whose technique was not, quote-unquote, perfect. Liszt was infamous for saying, leave your dirty laundry at home. He didn't want to deal with technical problems, and he considered that before people getting to him, students should fix their technique with someone else. There is an account, for instance, of how training went in Leschetizky's house in Vienna, where lots of the students actually lived, and there would be countless hours of playing technical exercises, nothing else. Moisevich, who arrived to Leschetizky as a prodigy, as a gifted child, was actually quite disappointed because he thought he has it all. And I forget what he played, but Leschetizky said, I could have played this better with my left foot, which is very unwelcome for a new student. At which point he proceeded to actually take him in for 4 years, teaching him most days of the week, as was the point of living in the teacher's house. Until he started giving him comments. And then asked, Benno, do you think our last few lessons were odd? He said, yes, master, you're not telling me anything. And Leschetizky said, because I think you're ready. And so he got him a letter of commendation, which started his career. Lots of etudes. But not the kind of etudes like da-da-da-da-da. Different. The etudes for beginners we did have, like Czerny and Kulak, they were written way back in the Schumann, even late Beethoven era. These were etudes which were destined to bring multitudes into the world of piano. You know, lift your fingers, keep it even, you know, keep your wrist loose. Now we're talking about a whole new generation of etudes which are designed to educate the virtuoso. So everything under the sun, leaps and octaves, and double thirds and double sixes, and basically looking at Chopin etudes and Liszt etudes as a model, you see how you can do prep studies for these works specifically by training people to, you know, hold and trill with two voices and so on and so forth. Sometimes when you look at a piece of music that looks particularly difficult, you're looking at the tip of an iceberg. Because a lot of such similar music is just not played anymore. The music itself is not good. It's written by third-rate composers, but it very much pursues the same goals as the Campanella or Chasnège or what have you. It's just that much of this music is gone from the repertoire, and unless you're specifically looking for it, you won't find it. But everybody wanted to write another Campanella, and so of course they copied Liszt's techniques. I already mentioned that. These techniques, of course, are not necessary for an evening of Haydn sonatas. But that's the whole point, is that I could not find a recital program of Haydn sonatas at that time. I could find the F minor variations, yes, Paderewski and some others. The last sonata, the C major sonata, I could not find the others at all. And this is an interesting thing, because now you think that all, let's say, Beethoven sonatas are played all the time at your school, at my school. That's not the case. The sonatas with nicknames, remember those? Those were played all the time, all the time. Tempest, Appassionata, you know, Les Adieux, right? Moonlight, all the time. Every recital, Moonlight. But we also forget about a half an hour to 45 minutes of music that you will never hear, because you never played with the Shadorenka. And You didn't play the more extensive things by Moscheles or Mushkovsky, not the etudes. But they wrote a lot of music that great musicians like Joseph Hoffman also played all the time. Salon pieces that we don't play anymore. Let's listen to some music. So let's hear some Retrospective, just a little bit. And I very much urge you to do so, look at what it says, because this is, for instance, as a piano roll. Do you know what the piano roll is? Yes? In other words, we don't really know. We think that this is very close, but actually piano roll is the one thing at the time that you could edit by simply sealing off the punch in the paper and punching it elsewhere. So this will not have any mistakes, like a true acoustic playing. And so if it sounds either too perfect or sometimes sounds strangely timed, like for instance, most of free time recordings, this is one of the last students of Liszt, you should not take your bearings. Oh, this is student of Liszt, that's how, so-and-so it has to go. Because the piano rolls are of inferior quality and it sounds incredibly sort of garbled. It makes no sense at all. So piano rolls don't tell you the story, but except for the Shteinberg, there's hardly anything else. And so we take what we can, right? The others are all normal acoustic recordings. Yeah, this guy could play. You wanted to know, I don't know what piano he's on, but I can put my money that this is not a Steinway. Steinway has existed at the time, of course, there's no question, but was actually pretty slow to make inroads in the eastern part of Europe. And so it's maybe Becker or Bechstein or even a Plea possible. Courtauld preferred Grotrians. So there is a great variety that we don't see it anymore when we believe that when we talk about a concert piano, it has to look and sound like this. It's a big mistake. It's actually choices. Hans von Bülow came to America and played Chickerings. He did not play Steinways. Benno played Baldwins. So that variety came from what they heard in the instrument, what they wanted to hear. And of course, which piano maker has signed them up for the tour. Who paid them the money. But that lightness had, of course, to do with regulation of the instrument that we don't see very much. And so, yes, it's, of course, amazing virtuosity of the players, beyond question, but it's also the instruments that they had access to. This is very famous, you probably all know. The left hand in these recordings is nearly always very soft, and it has to do with this being a single mic that just caught the upper frequencies better than the lower ones. So do not assume that this has... Godowski talks about it. He says, in my youth, we had to pound the left hand to make it heard. So that's not what's on the recording. It's a deficiency of the process. You know, this fellow. He's actually not from St. Petersburg, or from Moscow. He's from Kiev, Ukraine. But he chanced to study with Blumenfeld, who happened to be Neuhaus's uncle. And there's a whole gang of musicians, Szymanowski, Rubinstein, Blumenfeld, who were all friends. And that was his teacher. Discovered that these tempos seem extreme, and it's easy to see, oh well, these are virtuosos, they're competing with one another over fast tempos, but the truth is that Mozart sonatas and concertos during the 20s and 30s are also that fast. Listen to Gieseking, for instance, right? There is something about speed that we still have to discover that seems normal to them and doesn't seem normal to... It almost feels like the recordings are not at pitch, but they are at pitch. That's the actual thing. This is a slide that already talks about things that we discovered, about repertoire being sort of lopsided. And so I'm skipping it and moving forward. So with all this kind of focus on advanced education, the question, of course, is so where do you educate the beginners? You do, and sometimes very well. It's just that the methods have not arrived yet. There hasn't been put down in the book. The books will be there. They will become necessary in the Soviet era when music education, along with other disciplines in sciences, arts, and languages, will become centralized. And you would need a book to teach exactly the same curriculum in Moscow as you teach in Vladivostok. So there is a significant gap between all these extraordinary achievements and down-to-earth book for beginners. But maybe that's a good thing, because there's time to figure out what to do with those beginner books. So when they finally arrive, they are of such good quality that they're still in print. And some of them have been in print continuously for over 60 years now, like the Nikolaev book. There's good reasons for that. It's because, the piano in this repertoire hasn't changed very much since then. So it makes sense to keep doing what you've been doing so well before. This is my former school. This is my dad's school. The Second World War kind of draws a little line in what people play and how they play it. This is a common factor to both world wars, is that with each of them, a big chunk of our repertoire disappears. Because people don't want it. They live amidst rubble with incredible loss of life, and they don't want to hear fancy, happy music. That's just the way it is. It happened, it kind of erased some of pre-World War I music, and it does so again. That's one. And two, there's this thing called historical or historically informed performances and musicology and all of that stuff that starts coming up. And it kind of begins to ridicule almost the frivolous, incredibly rubato, incredibly fast performances that we just heard. And there are kind of new champions to this new approach. Cassaducy, Schnabel, Fischer, no, you have to play all Beethoven sonatas. And they do. Schnabel comes to New York and he plays 2 Beethoven sonatas and Schubert B flat. That's what he does. He doesn't want the fancy pieces. So there's a lot of changes, and these changes are going to happen in a very different way in Soviet Union because it's now sealed off from the rest of the world. There is no flow of ideas on both sides of the border, and therefore the Russians kind of now go their own way. Total literacy and the creation of highly educated workforce. That is for the glories of the Soviet state. It's very good for the arts, don't get me wrong with that. But it creates a kind of uniformity that most of us, the freedom-loving people that we are, will accept. For instance, if you were in the 3rd grade in the music school in the fall semester, you had to play that. And so the choice is perhaps, I mean, you could choose between this present fugue and that one, but it had to be a present fugue that semester. And the guides are published. The guides are published for repertoire, for technique, for solfege, for most other things like that. It's very briefly going through familiar names and maybe unfamiliar names. So, you don't know Brassin and Langer, you know Leshtitsky, because I talked about Brassin is Belgian and Langer is actually Russian, but he studied in Germany, in Leipzig. And these are the very, very first people who actually taught in Russian conservatories. However, their students were Russian, and these were very important, especially, well, actually all 4 of them are important, because these are teachers of Rachmaninoff and Scriabin and Prokofiev and Yudina and Greenberg and pretty much everybody else. These people taught them. Yeah, taught him. That says something. By the time we think about the 4th generation, so to speak, right, from the founding of the conservatories, we really can talk about a school. Partially because they were now isolated, and they had 2, 3, 4 decades to figure things on their own. And so this is not just Neuhaus, but the other names I put here. And I have some recordings for you. We can listen a little bit to the playing. Mind the repertoire. I'm not putting virtuoso pieces for you anymore, right? So now it has all become very serious. Sorry, I have to stop and say that you today will still be critiqued for breaking the chords in the Beethoven sonata, maybe. So consider that kind of a remnant of the previous times where Bartók rolls pretty much all the chords in the opening of the Kreutzer sonata, right? And how people play, because I will put it into words, but it would be nice if you do it before I do. That's what happens. It's when it was not reissued on CD to get this kind of funny sound, but that's what we have. This is one of the older gentlemen who just happened to live forever, so. Imperfect technically, right? Something's changed. But it has other things. Which things? It has lost some of its lightness, right? A lot of it is gone. But they got something else instead, right? What is it? Who wants to try and put this in words? Here's one more, a hopeless romantic everywhere, but such a talent, right? It's just hopelessly romantic. This is lighter, but it looks like something has been purposely forgotten to get something else. Right? There's a new thoroughness and depth to the touch. It kind of comes at the expense of that incredible brilliance that we've heard before, and sort of like a pity to lose it. But at the same time, it comes also in the change of what the pianos are like, and the repertoire has changed dramatically. I mean, Feinberg, recorded the Walther per clavier. He did not record Chopin etudes. It's a different attitude. Now playing has this aura of gravity to it, which is both good and not so good, because some pieces may not require that sort of gravity. I remember a professor in Budapest told me some years ago, when I was still a student, that when Richter came first to Budapest, there was a big commotion, because it's Richter, and everybody came to hear, and he came to hear, and Richter kept coming, every few years. And he said, we all realized that this was very, very serious. And then he said, but maybe it was very serious all the time. Which is a criticism, I'm sure, and you have to have some guts to criticize Richter. But the truth of that is that sort of gravitas is actually in the way we teach, they taught. Let's go back to these. This is different. This is not the glorification of the performer. This is public service. In other words, the change is first and foremost the change in attitude. We are not here to do a variety show. We're not here to do an amazing spectacle. We're here to, help people understand Beethoven. Makes sense? And it's a noble mission, okay? And they do not say these things lightly. You need to be historically informed. Beethoven is not Mozart and Chopin is not Schumann, right? So the distinctions were always clearly made by my teachers, they were. And the last bullet point is very revealing, and it comes directly from something like Udina, who had tremendous technique, but wouldn't care to re-record a bunch of wrong notes. It didn't matter to her at all. If she felt that she captured the spirit, the message, you listen to the same 32 variations. Truly, she had all the technique in the world to play them without an error, and yet she recorded them with a tremendous amount of wrong notes, and beautifully. As a musician, she did amazingly, as she always did. And she walked away from the studio because that was her message that day. She didn't want to make corrections to it. It's a nearly complete turnaround. Now, this whole sort of old German school lightness with a suspended wrist and light tapping fingers is not appreciated. Why? These composers, this is with the whole arm, and the arm weight has to go into the bottom of the key, and that is the sound that we all know and love. Okay? One of the most enduring images that the Russian school created is that of a bridge between the player's shoulder and the bottom of the key. Right? A bridge which connects the two entities. My teacher in New York said one of the best compliments I ever got is I was called a centaur. Part pianist, part piano, right? In other words, this kind of incredibly deep immersion in the instrument that creates very legato sound, very singing, very deep, very projected touch. Okay? As opposed to the obsession that the early 20th century performers had with so-called total relaxation, which you can't really achieve. It can only be done in bed when you're sleeping, perhaps. It's the engagement of the arm, the engagement of the wrist, the engagement of the elbow and the fingers, making them elastic, flexible, and participant. And the second enduring image that this has given us is that the sound is not struck, it's drawn. As though the piano already has the sound and you're drawing it from within the instrument. In a sense, what they created kind of blurs the distinction between the sound, the way to play the piano and the way to play the violin. It's a continuous, uninterrupted engagement of arm weight and wrist motion that makes one play. So there are distinctions to be made by fingertip, wrist, and elbow, each of which had its own etudes for it, own exercises, and even specific pieces which would be primarily given because they help the student develop a certain type of motion. So it's easy to see how Czerny etudes work on finger independence and evenness, but there are also a lot of wrist studies in that same Czerny or Kulak or Kramer or whatever. And as I said, sometimes pieces were used to, get a student do a specific motion. For instance, connecting two chords on the same motion. Right. So it's in other words, the pieces, especially pieces in the beginner and intermediate level, would be targeted because they had a specific technical component to them that could be made available. You don't abandon notes. You don't leave notes unattended. Your long notes, you hold on to them for dear life until it's time to go on to the next note in the melody. A tremendous amount of emphasis is on finger independence. And it's not just the amount of etudes, but it's also how different the etudes are from each other. And we always had this imagery of a small apple or a plum inside our hand, right? You're nodding because you had Russian teachers. They curve the arch as being absolutely indispensable as that very thing which receives and is able to sustain the weight of the whole arm, right? Equally, being prepared early and aiming early and being exactly above the target note, right? So sloppiness is very much discouraged. This is probably the most important thing, really, because most of, for instance, my early schooling was a continuous study of wrist. Because of the many functions that the wrist has, not just in piano, but in our body in general, of all the things that it can do, and its extremely complex anatomy of this very joint here. There's actually 8 little bones sitting inside here. Each is responsible for you being able to do this, the grabbing and the throwing and the turning and all of these other things. And so a wrist motion becomes kind of crucial in this whole edifice. It is a shock absorber, right? Because when you go into the piano, physics tells us that the piano goes back at you, and you need to absorb the impact of your own instrument. It is a weight transfer from finger to finger, right? So in other words, it acts like your hips when walking, right? Transfers your weight from foot to foot. It anticipates the arrival of anything, anywhere, right? And it connects the fingers to the rest of the arm, which means if the wrist is frozen, is not moving, is not participating, the arm weight is not flowing, and the sound is reduced to the finger action, which is shallow and not singing. One of the key steps in preventing injuries, and actually in the fact that I don't remember many injuries among classmates in piano, is because the wrist was not allowed to stop and therefore not be susceptible to a direct hit from either the performer or the piano. Does it make sense? Because this is such a vulnerable area for us, right? So who has had struggles with carpal? This is more of a kind of circular and long distance motions, which happen in scales or arpeggios, but also in leaps. So you can read the slide behind my back as I'm talking. But obviously not attached and not drawn up, as you, I'm sure, know, but also participating in anticipation in leaps, right? Where is the Petrushka fellow from yesterday? Tremendous leaping, right? So the position of the elbow, again, is very, very similar to what happens in string crossing in the violin. Is they actually fix the spot in the elbow that is equidistant from both strings, right? So very similarly, we find a place in the elbow which is equidistant between our departure and arrival points as we leap. Right? So that is no part in the leap is too far. Make sense? And the elbow helps absorb the biggest, heaviest chords, right? So again, so that we don't hit ourselves, but actually just produce the sound. I like the picture. Keep it there. This is important, just like, I always ask my students if this is the best way to lift a pencil, and so of course this will do, right? However, I'm sure that the computer will require 2 hands. And so, in the same way, the school has learned to help people do the task that needs to be done with the correct agency. Not lift pencils with the whole arm, and not try lifting boulders with fingers alone. Does it make sense? This is hugely important because none of it would have worked without support skills. And this is not just about piano playing, this encounter. Your solfege teacher could easily kick you out of school by giving you a bad grade. You'll be gone. And interestingly enough, you could never, ever run to your applied piano teacher and complain. They wouldn't listen to you. They'd automatically take the side of your solfege teacher. We were all afraid of our little old ladies who taught us solfege. Most of them were there in the early days, of the communist state, I'm sure. And they were in their late 70s and 80s when my mother was a child, so go figure. They had the secret. And they were absolutely merciless, but they taught us to hear. Hear things that haven't happened yet. Hear things that you see on the page for the first time. And just sing them with correct rhythm, pitch, and an acceptable tone. This is one of the things I struggle with in where I am right now, because even though they say they have it, I'm not sure they do. And so we're trying to put as much singing as we can into everything. Because nothing scares me more as a teacher than a student who looks at the page and there's no music playing in their head. I'm very, very afraid of it. So this and rhythmic movement, it's similar to Dalcroze, but it's not quite Dalcroze. Who knows what Dalcroze eurythmics? Sort of. 2 people tentatively raising their hand. It's a pretty powerful thing. It basically teaches your body to be involved in the rhythm and the spirit of music that you're listening to. It's a very powerful tool. You can see how toddlers respond to music and how rhythmic they are. And you may wonder, what in the world has happened to us? How come we struggle with, 3 against 2? 20 years later, we're still trying to sort this out. We had a class twice a week where we would be taught to move to music. We had a lady playing an upright piano in the corner, and we would walk and dance and do figures in the air to that. And if the character went right, or if we were out of state, it would be on that basically. But this is, again, this is a very important thing. It's not to try to make or create a rhythm where you sit at any Beethoven sonata looking at it for the first time, because you understand the patterns. You're familiar with those rhythmic experiences. You're familiar with the concept that rhythm and meter are not the same thing, right? Yeah, no movable do there. Dictation. Who is taking dictation? Good, fantastic, all right. How hard were your dictations? So yeah, it starts with just a regular one part, but then advances to 2 and 3 part dictation, of course, and then harmonic dictation. Who has taken harmonic dictation? Good, fantastic, more. We need every hand in the room to be up. What does this actually do? Again, this shaves weeks and months from practicing the new piece. Because again, you look and you hear, you look at the chord and you know what it is and how it sounds. You haven't played a note yet. Or maybe you can't play those notes. Maybe it's a string quartet or orchestra score you're looking at. But you can hear and you understand. Moreover, you understand why that chord and this chord are in that succession, right? So this keeps talking about the quasi-del prose, right? This went on all of pre-K and K all the way through the end of 3rd grade. So if you enter the school early enough, you will be having it for 6 years straight. And so these were more and more complex. We would actually do dances and such. The idea, of course, would be not to turn you into a dancer, but to make you a very rhythmic individual who anticipates rhythmic patterns, who knows how the body responds to them. There was this class in 1st grade. It was called simply listening to music. And we would bring a notebook and write whatever we wanted to write about what happened in the piece, and then chat. This was a precursor to music literature. But as someone who has to teach piano literature now for many, many years already, I can tell you, I wish we all had that when we were little. Not only because the students would recognize the piece, but more importantly is because when I ask questions about what has just happened, I'm always, not always, sometimes met with a blank stare. And so being able to pick up things of ever-increasing specificity in the music that you have never heard before, I think is an important thing for a musician. Especially if it's not your instrument that's being played, but something completely different, right? So, in other words, it's like going to concerts. What do you go away with? Well, it depends on what sort of prep work you've done on your listening skills. Because listening skills, just like memorization or rhythmic training or solfege, it's like muscle. It requires exercise. As I already mentioned, applied curriculum for each grade. And it's gone now. It's still published, but you don't have to follow. Back then you could follow, and this actually meant that the teacher who is out in the rural area could still get their hands on what was considered the proper progress from piece A to piece B to piece C, from this scale to that etude to that etude. And so a lot of the guesswork for the young teachers who were just starting out was taken care of, I think, which I think is not a bad idea. We talked about etudes a lot, and so I'm going to skip on that. The repertoire is interesting because Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, all the Romantics, yes, and then at a certain point it would fizzle out and it would be mostly contemporary Russian Soviet composers for the simple reason that you couldn't get the music for most other things, or that they were considered not good by the Soviet state. It's of course all changed now. Now you can tell whatever you want. But I remember asking about more contemporary scores even afterwards, in the late 90s, and the answer was we don't have those. So the isolation had its own negative effects, of course, and also it was plain dangerous to perform Hindemithing sonatas. You could lose your job, because these were Western artists. Same for chamber music. Pianists, name one important ensemble, chamber ensemble with piano, from that golden era. It's difficult. Certain ensembles did happen, but they were ad hoc. Right? The Boarding String Quartet is very famous, but the fact is that you'd be considered a mostly soloist. Mostly soloist meant not really willing to do much chamber music, I suppose, which is weird. This is boring stuff, but you had the chance to be being kicked out of school a number of times. It would be particularly painful to be kept in 8th grade, I suppose. So, parents were recruited to be the helpers at the home. So much so that if your parents were not musicians, you had to prove yourself by being better than everybody else. They were expecting the parents to, do it with you. It was assumed, and I'm saying it for everybody who is either teaching now or is supposed to be teaching tomorrow or something, that it was supposed that parents would help. And I always ask my students who are starting to teach, so what are you doing about the parents? Are they sitting in the lesson or you send them away? And so I said, okay, I don't want the parents in the lesson. So how does it work? How's it going 6 months later? How's it going? Are you getting much down from your 6-year-old student? Well, yeah, I'm going to play one more little tune for you and send you on your way. Maybe this is what this will. That concert when they didn't have enough seats in the hall. That's easy, but think what went into this. Think what people like him had to go through in their training, what they actually had to know, what they had to learn, and what they had to accomplish before this could happen. Right? So we are very easy to assign this is talented, whatever, but think that this is the fruit of the tree. Right? Thank you for listening.